A few months ago, I was in Austria, and for the first time in my life, I really got to practice the Soviet-style boxing in detail. And I would say that this was quite a transformative experience for myself. One of the reasons for this is because my profession and my passion is actually human movement and researching the movement of the human body. And this Soviet school of boxing really emphasized this in boxing. And I felt like it brought the art into the boxing, not just the science, but the art of movement to it. And one of the most interesting things that I actually encountered was that while I was practicing this movement, going with the pendulum steps, and rotating my body, there's something familiar here. There's something I recognized. I've seen this somewhere before, some of these elements here. And I realized that both karate and kung fu have something similar to the Russian Soviet school of boxing. So let's first see why I thought that there are some similarities to karate. Even in the UFC, I think a lot of people see these karate-based fighters. You can see Conor McGregor, for example, who has this type of pendulum step. They're very agile in their feet, constantly on their toes, always bouncing like this way. Well, in Russian boxing, or the Soviet style boxing, it's the pendulum step that is very similar. It's not identical to the karate movement, but we have this in the boxing. So this constant back and forth jumping, which then also allows you to basically close distance and also evade punches. A lot of it is based on not just like taking hard punches into the high guard, but it's actually keeping distance. So you throw a punch and immediately step back, jab, immediately back, cross back, hook, and even when you throw the hook, you're jumping back. So this style is very much dependent on a very fast and agile step. So this was the first thing that caught my mind, like this is so similar to what I've seen in karate point fighting as well. The other thing that is very similar to karate actually is the rotation of the core. In traditional martial arts, not just karate, but even taekwondo, when we are practicing forms, I used to practice taekwondo, and you have these positions, you're really emphasizing that full rotation. The punches are not thrown in this manner, where like reaching towards and brawling, or even keeping your weight in the front. For example, in Muay Thai, sometimes we keep the weight here. Instead, the posture is very upright. So actually, when I was learning this in Austria, one of the big things for me, and what was very difficult for me to perceive, was that I really need to keep myself here, even while doing the boxing. And punching, I cannot be leaning forward. It almost felt like unnatural to keep myself so upright. But this is what we can see in traditional martial arts as well, where your posture is very erect. And the power comes from the kinetic chain, from pushing with your back leg, rear leg, and getting that full rotation first from the hip, and then the core, and then the shoulder. Bam. And even what I've seen, for example, in some karatekas, they here, and when they throw their cross, they jump like this way. Bam. This is almost identical movement to what you can see even Dmitry Bivol and his trainer sometimes practice. They're in the bladed stance and boom, they switch and turn their hips. So it's incredibly similar type of movement to these Eastern martial arts actually.
So it's not actually by coincidence that the Soviet style of boxing came to resemble some of these Eastern martial arts, karate and kung fu. It actually had a lot to do with the Soviet Union, like the name, Soviet boxing. And this is because even though boxing was brought to Russia from the Western world, this was the original influence, they in the beginning did not really receive it that well, especially the professional boxing for the money was seen as something very capitalistic, and the boxing in the Western part was seen more like this brutal, unsophisticated way of fighting. They banned the professional boxing, so you couldn't even make money with it. So the only form of boxing that was then allowed was amateur style of boxing, which then meant that the emphasis was not really in knocking out the opponent, but it was on gaining points, so more like point fighting, very technical form of fighting. Now this is why I think partially why it became to slightly resemble the karate, especially with the footwork. And the pendulum step was the apparently most efficient answer to do this.
So we have the pendulum step, we have the erect posture, we have the rotation. But then what separates this actually from the karate and takes it more towards Kung Fu is the relaxation. So I think Bruce Lee said this the best. He said that the karate punch is like an iron bar, it goes wham. And the Kung Fu punch is like an iron chain with an iron ball attached to its end, and it goes like whang.
A Kung Fu punch is like an iron chain with an iron ball attached to the end, and it goes whang.
So this is just, I think, a perfect metaphor to describe these differences, where on one end, in karate, you have this very linear and stiff and rigid punch. Bam! You're like punching, through a wall like this way. Whereas Kung Fu is more like, it doesn't necessarily penetrate from a direct point, but it's more like it just, it's like goes, kind of gives this like a kiss on the cheek, like that way. But for example, Bruce Lee said that this hurts you from the inside, and it's not necessarily a light punch. There can be a huge amount of force to it. But why this happens is because the Russian boxing, and both, not all Kung Fu styles, but many Kung Fu styles, including Tai Chi and Qigong, understand and emphasize the wave-like motion of the body. They emphasize this efficient, I'd say almost effortless power transfer of the body. And in order to do this as effortless and as efficient and as economical as possible, the arm cannot be stiff. The shoulder also, it cannot be stiff. So it has to be much more relaxed. In which case, the punch, instead of resembling something like a thrust with a spear, bam, it's more like a throw. Like this way. So that's, in essence, is more like the punch in these a lot of these Kung Fu styles, which emphasize that wave-like whipping motion, and also the Russian boxing. The difference is really that in order to do this, a lot of these fighters, for example, when you look at their training material, they're training their hands down. And this doesn't even mean that they're fighting like this way, but they might be training like this way. They keep the hands down, and then boom, 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 boom. So they're just throwing their arms. And you can see this, for example, very clearly in one of the most successful boxers at the moment, Dmitry Bivol. His punches for example, when he's doing shadow boxing, you can know this, they have this trajectory. It's like he might hold his arm here, and when he punches, he leaves. The punch, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it does this motion where it circles and comes back. Here, boom. And when you look at some of the old clips of the Russian boxers practicing, they might be even doing this. So it's this sort of pummeling motion with the arm. This, for example, in Monkey Kung Fu, there's punches where you're blocking here, and then you do this. Boom. It's almost like this circling uppercut. Boom, boom, boom. This motion is the exact opposite of this sort of a bit more like Russian style cross, bam. And then you have the opposite direction. So see, why are people doing this? You may know this even yourself, that if you're punching and you need to return the arm like this way, it takes a lot more force, a lot more energy to pull the arm straight back compared to letting it swing and rotate like this way. And the Russian style was really focused on this economical, relaxed motion and conserving energy as much as possible.
You might ask, how on earth did it become so fluid and so focused on the relaxation? And what explains this is actually the scientific development. So the Soviet Union took the scientific study of the art of boxing very seriously. They monitored and tried to measure, really observe the movement in the boxing and tried to determine scientifically what would be the most efficient way to move and to produce power and dominate your opponents, how to be a superior fighter.
And what I really think that makes Russian boxing much more towards Eastern martial arts than towards, let's say, Western boxing is this one thing. So both in karate, in taekwondo, even in kung fu, you have a certain form. You have, for example, kata. where you're practicing certain basic techniques, punches and blocks, right? And then when it goes to the fighting or point fighting or sparring, suddenly it looks very different. So you can see that the practice forms are very different from the actual application in the fighting. And sometimes people make the mistake looking at these forms like, well, it doesn't work or it's like useless or something. But actually, we can see the same separation, at least in my observation, also in the Russian boxing. Because like I said, a lot of these people, they even practice with their arms down like this way, and they're doing this like very weird looking punches, trying to be as relaxed as possible. And it just looks like they don't even fight necessarily like this way. But what the Russian guys and also the Russian scientists understood is that in order to really embody and completely fully digest these principles of relaxed motion, you need to take it back a notch. Not focus so hard and be so fearful, like always, like keeping super rigid guard here, like this way. Because when you are focused on this protection and keeping everything super rigid, you can't learn the relaxation that is required for the Russian style of boxing. So actually, they were able to train the principles and the methodology of the Russian style with a form that didn't necessarily resemble the exact form in the ring and during the sparring or during competition. But it still worked. Getting rid of these more rigid rules of always keeping a high guard allowed these people to much better than really internalize the relaxation of the body. And after that, also apply a more even a guard to that movement as well.
And so it was this combination of this focus on the amateur boxing, very technical type of point fighting, together with this very deep scientific research into the biomechanics of the human body that then created the Soviet style of boxing. And so it also became something that has these elements that we can see even in Eastern martial arts, Kung Fu and Karate. And if you think about it, even in Shaolin Temple, these martial arts, the Kung Fu, they were studied as a real form of science as well. And this is one of the reasons why these movements, even in the Kung Fu as well, they became more like an art form that was extremely refined. And I think this is where also the Soviet style of boxing starts to resemble more of actual real, even real martial arts to an extent. It's an interesting form of art for sure.
So now, when we combine this pendulum step and this agile bouncing from the karate, and we combine that into the more relaxed punching of Kung Fu, essentially, we get the Soviet style of boxing. Now, I would say in recap that Soviet style of boxing, it is more than the sum of its parts. So it's not just pure, of course, combination of karate and Kung Fu put together. It has a lot of unique elements as well. But I think these principles are just too striking to not notice this clear similarity between these sports. It's not like one or the other style is better. Even here you can see that they are combined together. And I think this is really in the heart of martial arts in general, that you can take from multiple different styles and put them together into a format that works specifically for you. But I would say I would highly recommend to try some of these principles that you can see in the Russian boxing, because for me this was incredibly inspiring. Inside of me there was a completely new interest evoked towards boxing and the art of boxing, precisely because of the Soviet style school, because it really emphasized the body mechanics, and it brought almost like this new, let's say, realm in the body that I'm able to then refine further and further. And I really love the emphasis on this like proper full rotation and utilizing the body to its maximum extent and to its full potential within this Russian style of boxing. So I hope this also inspires you to pay attention to it more and try it out.